Good morning. Our scripture lesson for this morning comes from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So this week, I saw a status update from Tara Miller. This is Terry's wife. She's not here this morning. And she had a friendly, I don't know, maybe she is. She's in French Lick, Indiana. Is that the home of Hoosiers? Larry Bird. Come on, Celtics. They should have had that game. Anyways, listen, she posted a friendly PSA on Facebook, and it read the following. She said, "Here's your friendly parenting advice now that school is over. Go and clean out your kids' book bags. I now know where all these fruit flies were coming from." And I'd love to know more of the details of that story. But anybody relate to that experience? Have any parents been there when it comes to a diaper, that you had a diaper bag catastrophe? You're like, what is that smell? Then you reach your hand down in the purse, down in the diaper bag, and there's, ooh, yucky. I believe it was a banana in your all's case. Any of you ever left a coffee with milk like in the back of your car for a couple days? It sours. Any of you been there? And just for fun, I wanted to ask you, because I did this a few days ago, are any of you out there like angry cleaners? Like you're an anxious cleaner? You're like, there's something happening in my world that I can't control, but you know what I can control? That this dirt is on my floor and the stains, and like any of you angry clean? Me. So I had a rough couple hours with the girls this week on Tuesday, and they were just clingy and fighting and whining, and I loved them, and you know what I did? I was like, I'm going to clean around you. If you're going to whine and need me, I'm going to chase you and be chased with a mop in my hand. And so I hardcore mopped like the whole downstairs while they were just screaming and crying. And it was my way of dealing with it. Call CBS if you need to. But it was reality. And whether it's a backpack, whether it's a diaper bag, whether it's angry cleaning, whether it's your car, or even our interior worlds that we are attempting to navigate and lead a little closer to Jesus this summer, sometimes, how many of you know you just need a fresh start? Some of you need or have made that transition into a new career. You've made a transition into a diet change or exercise change or any sort of habit that you're just looking for some kind of fresh start. The reality is that there is no such thing as a fresh start without an acknowledgement of where you are and where things are as they really are. The series that we started last week is based in a vision for three things that come to us through Paul's prayer in Ephesians chapter 3 to this church in Ephesus. And there's a vision for kind of three things. I want to revisit this really fast. Number one is introspection. And that is to say that it's a vision for a life of interior examination. It is an entire way of life that considers, you and I, this is what we're invited to this summer, and really for the whole of our lives. It's a life that considers the realities of our inner worlds for the sake of our own flourishing and our call to love other people well. It's a vision for wholeness. And that is to say that it is a life that isn't divided, but it is integrated. It's not fractured, but mending. It is healing. It is to know yourself and to know God, neither of which can be fully known apart from one another. It's really the book of Psalms over and over again. And finally, it's a vision for transformation. And that is to say, a life that is being remade into the image of Jesus. And as you know yourself and you know God, you become like God and you do what he would do. It's a life open to the grace and presence of God that grows in our awareness of our own blind spots and shadow sides and even hiddenness. And all that to say, our big idea in this entire series over the course of the summer is to say something to the degree that in different ways that are unique to each of us, probably we could use some type of a fresh start. A good purging of some things in our lives. A good angry cleaning of the soul. And there is a life that we truly long for. And there's a life where you are your truest self. And there's a life where you make a difference in the lives of other people, where you discover that God often heals you from what he heals you for. And all that is found somewhere in your unique blend and journey through these things of introspection and wholeness and transformation. And here's a quick nugget right from the top, something that I'm becoming increasingly holding hard, like tighter and tighter, is that I believe that all transformation is ultimately story transformation. All transformation is ultimately story transformation. Whether we are aware of it or not, you and I are living according to some scripts, some neural pathways, some stories that we believe about ourselves and the world. Some of it is true and some of it is not true. And here's an example: a life that transforms out of thoughts of suicide at the hands of depression into hope and purpose and future is a life that has changed the story it is living into. That's story transformation. Or it's a life that transforms from living for the next meal or sugar rush, or a life that is ultimately distracting itself with another pool day or yet another Netflix binge. That is a life that's replacing the scripts that say, maybe I need to keep distracted so I don't have to confront who I am and what I think I am worth or not. A life that ends the cycle of fatherlessness in your family, or alcoholism, or teenage pregnancy, or just being mean, or working your life away at the expense of your family. That is story transformation. All transformation is ultimately story transformation. And you and I, we can't actually have a meaningful conversation about wholeness and transformation this summer if we're not also going to deal with some of the less beautiful aspects of the story that we live into. We can't talk about wholeness and transformation and grace and freedom and the life you're longing for without talking about something else. Maybe you're picking up on where I'm heading from the scripture we read today, which seems like a downer. But remember Langston Hughes' poem from last week? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'll read it again. He wrote, "I am so tired of waiting. Aren't you? For the world to become good and beautiful and kind. Let us take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the rind." Worms eating at the rind. There's a word for that. There's a category for that. There's a concept for that. There's a name for this not so beautiful aspect of all of our stories. There's a name for the power underneath the powers and the corruption and the greed and the envy and the jealousy and the anger and the things that we see in our world. And that word is sin. And listen, we are wasting our time. I say this in love. We are wasting our time we will be wasting our time because there is no such thing as transformation or wholeness or introspection without our wrestling with and confronting sin, not just as a concept, but at the level of our own interior worlds. And here's a framing thought for where we're heading today. And this is what we need. It's that desperation often precedes transformation. If we are not desperate out of something, a calling not just into a more beautiful way in the life of Jesus, not just the good side of the invitation towards healing and wholeness and mending and the beauty of the kingdom of God in apprenticeship with him, we must also be desperate for a longing of the healing of the thing that we can't heal for ourselves. We must be desperate to find things come out of their brokenness and even, dare I say, out of the own corruption that we carry in our hearts. You and I are unable to participate in our own transformation if we are unable or unwilling to talk about the rotten banana in all of our school bags, and that is sin. And I promise you, there is no zipper strong enough to contain the fruit flies and the stench and the rot that is just dying, slowly decaying in that backpack over time. Fleming Rutledge once wrote, he said, "It is endeavoring to look sin straight in the face that we are able to understand grace." So let's look it in the face today. And in a certain way, we need to recover sin. That may sound weird, but here's what I mean by that. If we are to understand what Jesus is inviting us to, we must understand what Jesus is rescuing us from. If we're going to make sense of the cross of Jesus, the brutal suffering and death of Jesus, and 3 days later, his resurrection, if we are going to make sense of when the prophet Isaiah says that by his stripes we are healed, we must know part of why Jesus came in the first place. And if we have no awareness, no serious wrestling with, no proper positioning, no mental framework or emotion attached to our own sin, or if we are too easily dismissive of it, then our entire conversation of wholeness and transformation this summer is kind of like another spiritual exercise of self-aggrandizing, do-it-yourself soul gluttony wrapped in Christian terminology. And I love you too much to leave this stone unturned. Our teaching text today would have been a lot nicer, a lot more fun if I started at verse 4, where it's like, but God, being rich in mercy. But it doesn't. It doesn't start there, does it? It starts with, as for you, you were dead. Mercy, a picture of mercy is incomplete without the first phrase. And I get it. And let me humanize this for a second. I know that to open the conversation around sin is to open a huge box. It's to open a lot in your experience most likely. And for some of you, you're probably like, finally, Matt is far too gentle and soft and nuanced and like reframing. This is the day. I've been waiting for this day. I've been waiting for him to tear us all, not me, but the others off their little gentle, kind, loving pedestal and knock them down to where they really are so that I continue to feel a certain way. Like here, this is the day. Like so much nuance that comes out of Matt. This is the day to just paint the picture, the bloody, gruesome, hell-bound, sinful nature of all of us that we are going to just correct at the right time in the right way at the behavioral level. Like, you're ready for it. You're like, please get angry today. Please. For others, you're ready to crawl under your seats and hide from your Christian PTSD. Because you're just waiting for what level of anger is he going to bring to this and what is on his soapbox today that may be triggering for me or not triggering for me. What sort of cultural taboo are we going to be angry about today? What sort of tribalism is about to happen that I'm going to feel good about not being those people, PTSD, full on happening? And hopefully neither of those is about to happen. The reality is, let's be honest again. Culturally speaking, we no longer discuss sin, and we've ripped it of its meaning linguistically, culturally, postmodern, like all the things. And often our churches have followed suit. And what you end up with is one of two extremes. Sin doesn't really exist, or everything is sin, and it's just fear-mongering. We no longer call things sin. It feels harsh. It feels oppressive. It feels like a power play. It feels like an exercise of the privileged. We trivialize and nuance and dismiss and domesticate and push things under the rug. We rename things to feel better about that. We rationalize. We do all the things. And we perform linguistic gymnastics to make it seem like things that are in fact a big deal are not. The problem is, though, when we stop discussing sin altogether, we are left with no paradigm and no words for the very real thing that we feel that is tugging us in one of two directions. More towards the image of Jesus and away from the image of Jesus. How do we have words to explain the deep power behind powers, the deep sin, the deep corruption behind the things that are visible in our own lives and at a societal level. We deceive ourselves, and self-deception around sin creates disorientation and numbing so that we misdiagnose the problems in us and in our world. And when we misdiagnose the problem, we prescribe the wrong antidote for the sickness, for both the personal and the societal pains we are experiencing. Are you tracking with where I'm going? The historical and modern fractures in our world need a category such as sin vast enough to make sense of our vast present pain. And I love studying sociology. I could nerd out on that. Like, weirdly enough, am I allowed to say this? Judge me, sinful, whatever. Like, I enjoy reading sociology more often than I do reading theology. Is that okay to say? It's all one and the same in a certain way. And I love reading psychology. If I were to go back to school for anything right now, I would want to go get all the certification, all the education I could on counseling or therapist so I could be a more effective pastor holistically. It's a constant temptation for me. Why do I love that? Well, because sociology and psychology are both powerful tools that can help us understand our own fractures, personal and cultural. It helps us name things that we feel and provide the right sort of process out of those things. But it is theology that places them in their larger and truer context. Sociology alone doesn't have the power to heal broken culture. Psychology alone doesn't have the power to mend the broken internal nature that we have. But undergirded and reframed in a theological context that understands who we are, how we're made, what the actual problem is, and then taking the best of social science and taking the best of emotional health and psychology, we can really take everything that God has given us towards a path for wholeness, transformation, and living into love. And in that way, and this may sound strange again to say out loud, but we need sin. We need that word. We need that concept. We need that category. We need this conversation. A thoughtful, loving, merciful, compassionate conversation. We can't talk about ourselves on our journey towards wholeness and transformation without it. Dallas Willard once gave this amazing word picture in this conversation. I love it. He said that when it comes to this conversation, he says, we are like farmers who diligently plant crops, but can't admit the existence of weeds and insects and can only think to pour on more fertilizer. That's what we do without this understanding. I love that word picture. But real quick, before we move on, let me circle back to something. This conversation indeed carries baggage in the church. And I joked earlier about Christian PTSD. Forgive me, because I know that's real for some. Conversations around sin have come to be associated with judgmentalism and bigotry and really selective but inconsistently held and practiced like moralism and legalism. And it's led people to believe that the only point of this conversation is to be used as a weapon for control or coercion. And I get that. Sin as a concept has been abused. It's been abused to control, and it's been used to shelter and even justify indefensible stuff. For some, this language of sin feels like a hammer to your soul. It feels like a weapon, a threat, a power play. But there are more redemptive ways of understanding sin and setting that as the trajectory in this conversation. Holding to the hope that we can learn to love in a way that restores. And if that's true, and if that could be done, shouldn't we try? Shouldn't we go there? So as Fleming Rutledge said, let's look sin square in the face today. You and I'm making an assumption about you. Be offended later. The reason that you and I came to church today is because at some level of who you are, from curiosity to commitment to recovery to giving it a second try or maybe a 25th try, you want to apprentice with Jesus. And to apprentice with Jesus is to deal with the rotten banana that is in all of our backpacks. So let's name it. Let's reframe it. And at the end today, we're going to take communion as a way to confess it and interact with Jesus, who is the ultimate healer of this thing that we call sin. So all this bears the question. That's really nice, Matt. But what is it? What is sin? Is it a behavior? Is it a certain thing? Is it an attitude? Is it a disease? Is it a heart problem? Is it a head problem? Is it a hands problem? Like, what is this thing? And lots of people through the years have given great definitions about what it is. And I've heard it said, maybe you're familiar with these, like it's anything less than God's ideal, or it's anything less than God's plan, or it's missing the mark, or it's an action or thought that doesn't reflect who God is, or it's outright a rebellion against God. It's a disordering of his perfectly ordered world. It's disobedience. It's turning away. It's a refusal on our part to image him as we are intended. And all of that works. And really all of that is in the text today. But in my experience, we usually think of sin in very legal terms, such as law breaking or trespassing or indebtedness, which are all helpful metaphors. I'm not saying they're wrong. But the problem I've run, both through conversations and literally my story, is that frame that tends to think of sin purely on legal, transactional terms, the fix doesn't become about something deeper. It becomes in something more at the level of right behavior and just sin avoidance. You know what I mean? We've cultivated that pretty well, actually, through the years. With sin, the presenting behavior is rarely the actual issue in the heart. But the way that we've cultivated a way to deal with this is to deal with it at the, well, just stop doing that. Avoid that behavior. Avoid those people. Don't become someone new. Don't worry about your heart. Don't renew your mind. Don't become more like Jesus. Just don't do that. Or don't be associated with those people. Exercise your willpower. Try really hard to increase your devotional time. Read 3 more verses this week. Spend 7 more minutes in prayer this week. Go to another Bible study. Lift your hands instead of have the holy grazers out here. Get them up in the air like you just don't care. Like, do the thing. Bend your knees and bounce as you sing. Like, well, the list could go on. For years, this was my story. Like in high school and college, on the outside, I was just a good church kid. I did a lot of good things. I did all the right stuff. And I didn't do many wrong things according to the culturally held list of really bad things in this room, to be honest. Like my entire walk with God and my identity as a Christian was more based on what I did not do as what I did do. It didn't ask the questions of motive and heart and attitude. It was just like, well, did you cuss this week? All right, man, cool. Did you smash another secular CD in the trash can at youth camp this week? All right, you did that this summer, but you must be backsliding because you had another CD to bring this summer. Like, did you wear a tank top that fully closed? Anyways, the pool, youth camp stories, PTSD. I get to, get to college and like all my friends, like, I just wrote them off as really bad people because they maybe drank a little bit or partied a little bit or did some things. And like, I'm not like vouching for it, but I'm also like, man, I was a real jerk. And I was really self-righteous. And yeah, maybe I didn't go partying, but I also like so harshly judged them in my heart for doing it that maybe I would have been better off just going and having a couple of beers and not like being a jerk about it. You're like, did he just say that out loud? Like, my identity was as fragile as my ability to avoid some things, which, surprise, isn't possible. It's not possible. The reality is my attitude sucked. And my friends, I became isolated from my friends. And I judged them in my heart. And the very people that God would have put me on a college campus to know and to love, I created walls and barriers in the name of not doing those things. And those people that do those things, they're the bad people. And they're not the mission field. There's the people to avoid, to protect my innermost behavior, moralistic, legal sense of my identity. That's part of my story. And it's probably part of yours in the past or right now. But there has to be a better way to frame sin. And here's what I want to present to you as our working definition for sin as a church family. It comes from a long line of thinkers, and it's distilled down to this simple phrase, that sin equals a failure to love. Okay, well, here's that nuanced gentleman again. Well, what about this? What do you mean sin is just a failure to love? Track with me. What is the greatest commandment as prescribed by Jesus? It is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So track with me. If the greatest commandment given by Jesus, the fullest, clearest, embodied picture of who God is and what he desires, if Jesus' definition, the greatest commandment, is rooted in love, then the greatest sin, maybe all sin, must in some way be the rejection of this command. Now, before you think that sounds a little cushy and soft and sentimental and millennial and Matt is just too gentle, where is the anger? That's not what I'm doing. What I want to do is actually frame our lives with God in ways that's the same for every issue, for every aspect of who we are. That's the same for every sort of question we must encounter. And to frame it with God and one another in the way that Jesus did, where love is the fulfillment of faith, and sin is the negation of it. If love is the greatest good, then sin must be the antithesis of that. Sin is not just, it is, but it's not just a violation of a law. It is that. It is behavioral. It does exist at the surface. But underneath that, the story is that sin is ultimately a disruption of love. It would be easy to see that definition, like sin as a failure to love, and then think about all the scripts that are told us and how soft and cushy and make it what you want to be, that idea of love is, and say, well then, okay, sounds great, because I don't see what the big deal is. If only sin is a failure to love, what does that mean for this, and this that I used to be told was wrong? Is that fair game now? Can I go do that? As long as I do it loving and nice and gentle and I don't step on anyone else's toes. Is that allowed? Is that how this works? Did you like that hip thrust? That was a lot of movement for me. I'm gonna be sore. Today, this isn't the day to define all that, as tempting as it is, and take them to their logical conclusions. But let me fast forward and say this. Following Jesus' definition and example of love and recognizing that God created the world with this ideal picture for us of joy and flourishing and beauty, all functioning in the context of love and community, to say that it is a failure of love at its root, that actually is a pretty big deal. That's a huge deal. We like to think of things in more punitive, legal terms, like if you do this, bad consequences. But what if the disruption of love, like an eclipse of your soul, if you live with an awareness of God's love towards you, it's like the sun in the sky, but sin is actually the thing that eclipses your viewpoint and your awareness of who God is, and it just disrupts this flow of love. Maybe that's the deeper issue. It's not that the action got in the way, it's that it's cutting you off from an awareness and a living into God's love for you. If that sounds cush to you, we need to have lots more conversation. And this is why Paul in part says that God hates sin. He hates it because God created a world that was pure and beautiful and good and kind and full of love. And then sin entered and made everything less than ideal. Did you all see the story a few weeks ago where a guy, I think it was with a pie, vandalized the Mona Lisa in the Louvre? I just can't say the museum, I blanked, the Louvre? Anyways, yes, I just pictured Survivor Man with Wilson running through there to save the day. What's that movie? Angels and Demons? Yeah. Go watch it. It's weird. But imagine being an artist, and you just opened a gallery that you've worked for years on, and you invite the public in, and it is exactly how you want it to be. And you spent hundreds of hours on these paintings, and they tell a story, and they communicate the essence of who you are and how you experience beauty and God's love, and it is a gift to the world, and you have curated it exactly how you want it to be. And then someone just walked in there and took a Sharpie to every single painting that you created and ripped it off the wall, and even threw out the snacks that you had bought for everyone to come to the show, and then ate them all and hoarded them, and then went to the back alley and set your dumpster on fire. Like, imagine, what would your emotional response be to someone corrupting and destroying the thing that you have made so beautiful and so intentionally? Anger. To say that God hates sin is a really fair thing to say. It's a really real thing to say. And that's not a thing to be weaponized. Sin is not just a big deal because it's like less than the ideal. Sin is also a big deal because it destroys relationships. Your relationship with God, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with others, your relationship with the world. And I want to hone in for a second on what sin does to your relationship with yourself. The ideal life as God has designed it is one that you would have just unmitigated connection and relationship to God your Father. And sin is what disturbs and distorts that relationship. But more than that, sin actually distorts your relationship with yourself. Because whether we want to admit it or not, and this is part of the reframing we need to have, at the innermost part of your journey towards wholeness, in that inner world that we are looking at and letting God shine a light on this summer, sin actually damages that. And in that mix, we experience a very powerful aftershock of an emotion out of that damage. And that's called shame. And shame is experienced only because we've done something not that's just bad, as your youth pastor defined it, but shame is experienced because we've done something counter to our nature, which is meant to project God's love to us and to others. Things aren't just wrong. Try to track this with me. And if you're a parent, I think you can make this connection more easily. Things aren't just wrong because God said so and he's a killjoy. Things are wrong at levels that they're wrong for you, in the way that God made you to experience him and flourishing and your own identity. Things that they're less than ideal because how do I say this? God doesn't want your perfection, but God wants you to flourish in his ideal setup for you. The problem is that to deal with this, over time, we numb our shame signals. We turn off our awareness of our conscience. We lose all sense of guilt and the need to even just confess something to anyone, let alone to God. And instead, we respond by numbing ourselves and trivializing and dismissing and nuancing everything to the point of uncertainty and staying busy enough to never deal with the root. But here's the real problem with that. Not because I'm calling you bad, and I'm not even naming things. I don't want to name things today. I think there is a lot of nuance, and I have a lot more questions than answers on some of this stuff. If you're like, is he going to give an answer on this today? Not today. Here's the real problem with that. Over time, you become less and less human. You become less and less yourself because you no longer function as you're meant to in the world, and your behavior is a problem, but it's not a problem at the surface level. It's a problem because whether you and I know it or not, our behavior on the surface is like a self-sabotaging act of violence that gets deeper and deeper and deeper into our soul over time. And over time, it destroys your relationship with yourself, which is to destroy your relationship with God, which is going to lead to a failure to experience and walk in love. You see how this works? Layers, layers, layers. And if we get the ultimate framing of this more correctly calibrated, it has profound implication on how we think about this. And eventually, this leads to like an alternate identity. It's what Paul called in his text that we are children of wrath instead of children of God. And for many of us, I'd say it's just like a failure to trust what we believe. That's a phrase you're going to hear me say a lot this summer. And the correction, the way out of this, is not just to live more morally, because no one's ever convinced at that level. I can know for years that I was and still am and working on it like overweight. But logic didn't get me to change our diet. It's something deeper, much deeper. There's something in your life that you know logically, morally is like something that's recurring. But that's never what changes hearts. So to recap, tracking all this way through, we destroy our relationship with God, which prevents us from being fully human as God intended. And from there, we tend to commit acts of violence to our own souls over and over. And then from there, we have nothing to give to anyone else. And it alienates us, and it destroys our relationships with God. And when we turn from God and turn towards ourselves, this inevitably means that we've turned from other people. And herein lies one of the great myths of how sin works in our lives. The myth is that sin is and can be held at a personal and private level. We fool ourselves. We deceive ourselves into thinking that the banana rotting in the bag is just going to stay there with no implication for myself or for other people. But some of us have a stench in the house. We have a stench in our relationships, and it can't be hidden. It can't be hidden. We believe that our dysfunction can remain hidden. I want you to try this on for a moment, and then I want to shift gears. Just hold this thought in tension for a moment. It is true at a cultural level in the way things are being redefined. I don't mean that angrily, and I'm not pointing finger at a particular thing today by any stretch. But if you look at a trend macro level, I want you to try this on at a cultural level and see if there's parts of you that fit into this. That when God is no longer God, when God no longer occupies the seat in your own heart that he is meant to, when the world gets further and further adrift from his ideal way that he created it. Again, I don't mean that in angry in a culture war, we got to return the world in America back to its glory days. I don't mean that. I just mean when the gap gets wider and wider, and then the self kind of becomes God, well, then nobody else has any value either. We do it in traffic every day. Just think about how easily you're like, I'm late for work. I'm going to drive 90 miles per hour instead of 70, endanger everyone else because I need to be on time. That is just a very surface level of saying that when things get difficult, we do it all the time. When God is no longer God in my life, and I kind of take over that role, people become collateral damage. I know we don't believe that. We don't believe that's good. We would never line up behind that thought as something that sin is only personal and private. But I can't say that many of us don't struggle not to live into this cultural norm a little bit right now. Like if I'm God, then my needs have to be met before any of your needs have to be met. And we have to push others then to justify why we should be in charge of our lives. I want to pick on one little thing, if that's okay. The arguing on every side. So I'm not pointing to a particular side or attitude at all. I'm just saying, if over the last 2 years, I were to put masks in the center of this table, you okay? Masks. And then every lane of people having discussion around that topic, a lot of it, in my opinion, you can disagree, boiled down to an expression of a desire for autonomy that shows that no one, for whatever reason, is the boss of me. That my desire to express things based on how I view it is the most ultimate thing. Some had that argument from this side, others from this side. I had views, you had views, and I'm just holding that up to gently say, one of the inevitable things that comes down the line of what sin does to us and stripping of us of our humanity, of a failure to love, is that we miss the point and we begin to say our view and our holding of expression, of power, of whatever else becomes what is ultimate. And I want to say this too. Whenever we come up against someone who has a different view than us on things that are really difficult and nuanced and controversial and emotional and heavy, if sin is a failure to love, love doesn't whisper or gossip about another person's sin or view. Whisper, gossip, yell, post, tweet, if anyone tweets anymore. Love doesn't do that. And I want to caution us. I want to caution you. I want to caution myself that in the name of processing, and then in the name of authenticity, and in the name of being open and transparent, all of good things that I'm here for, the scripture never lets you and I off the hook when it comes to destroying other people's character. And at its root, sin is a failure to love. And therefore, you may be like, man, I'm doing all right. Like, as I see sin, I have pretty good relationships. I'm not this, this, and this. And you're like, I don't understand. What do I have to be desperate for? Maybe that's the question you're asking today. And I want to challenge you this way and say that it is possible that our responsiveness to other people's sin, our attitude towards other people's sin, is of the same level of disruption of love and consequence and relational injury to God, to self, and to others as that thing that you are really into saying is wrong. And that is not to say that it may not be wrong. That is just to say, let's level the playing field a little bit. You okay? I have a whole other section. I'm going to have to stop. Can I say this controversially? Sin is not just personal. It's not just private. It is also not just individual. It can be corporate. It can be networked. It can be structural. It can be embedded in systems. It is embedded in systems. It can be in governments. It can be in nations. It can be in states. It can be in workplaces. It can be like the fabric of a shared culture among people. And the arguments currently we're having about no, sin is only personal. That's true. But what do personal people do? They gather and they create things, and then it passes on. So we have to also admit that to deal with sin is also to challenge very real systems and structures and even laws at times that are based in some faulty framework that disrupts love one to another in civil societies and religious institutions, in churches and community and all the things. Is that okay to say out loud? It is a reality. Sin exists at a personal level, an individual level, but also at a corporate and a shared structural level. It is internal and it is external. And sin is also not just a momentary thing. It's not just a mistake we made. It is an ongoing thing. It's a thing that passes on. It's why there are families that don't seem to be able to escape a cycle of alcoholism or fatherlessness or adultery. And you're like, what in the world? Are they like cursed? Is this Hawkins, Indiana? And there's this upside down that just like pokes them to like, oh, go commit that sin. Go like over and over. Or is there something deeper that we just have to say? Patterns of sin over time create scripts, they create stories, they connect neural pathways that are really hard to undo. And the origin stories throughout Genesis is a story over and over, from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel to Noah and the ark to the Tower of Babel. Like, read the first few chapters of the book. These stories explain why the world is what it is. But those didn't just end there. In different ways, you and I and other people and groups of people are reenacting those same stories every day in different ways. And here's the pivot. And yet, but God, being rich in mercy, but God, being rich in mercy, Paul said that because of his great what? Love for us. Not because of his great desire for right behavior out of us. Not but out of his great desire to hold the truth perfectly clear in your head, but because of God's great love for us, which includes those things, but not at an ultimate level. God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when you and I were dead in transgressions. It is by grace that you have been saved. The antidote for sin is not found anywhere other than the cross of Christ. Full stop. And I love education. No amount of learning will ever square that for you. No level of exercise, no level of reading, no level of doing good things in the world, no level of kindness and openness and humility, all good things will ever square that for you. It is the cross of Christ, the body of Jesus broken for you, that is the only thing that has the power to deal with the root that is going on in this great paradox that is the way of Jesus, that says, while you were yet sinner, while you had your back turned, while you had no intention of knowing God, while you were doing all the wrong things, while you thought the wrong things, while you acted on the wrong things, while you were yet at your worst and what you will ever become and be, Christ died for you. Christ looks at us and he looks at you at your worst, and somehow he says that you and I are worth it. And following Jesus means that we can say in one breath that a fragmenting power is at work within each of us and between all of us. And in the next breath, announce that there is a way out. And so the invitation today to stare sin in the face is not just to get in some scaring contest with the devil. It's not just to look at all your harshest, darkest, worst parts and just live there and meddle and be, oh man, that really, I don't like that about myself. It's actually to redirect the eyes of your heart onto Jesus, who's looking at you and loving you and meeting you where you are, as you are, at every point of your journey, at every point of your understanding, at every point of your behavior, and even at every point of your view on things that are controversial and difficult and you may never come to clarity on or agreement with other people on. He's looking at you and he's beckoning you to come as you are, to confess who you are to him, and to lean into the sacrifice that he has made. The prophet Isaiah says that it is by his stripes that we are healed. And in just a moment, we're going to create space, and we're going a few extra minutes longer, but this isn't something that you can get without this space as a family together. This is unique. And we're going to take communion, and I've got baskets up along the sides, and today it's still the cups, but I'm just going to invite you in your own timing when we sing in just a moment, that you can come up from one of these sides, grab it, take it to your seat, take it as you want, when you want. But I would encourage you to do one thing in that process, that you would take the moment to still your heart, to close your eyes, to connect with God, and just confess your need for him. Confess your need that it is God alone, through the power of Christ, that can heal you and mend you and map your inner journey towards him in ways that you didn't know were possible. And so I'm going to ask you to stand, and I want to give one final thought as we do that, and then we create this moment. Pies and I snuck off with the girls for a couple days this week to Gatlinburg. My parents are there, and it's a special place to us. It's where we got engaged. It's where I grew up going on vacation when we were kids, where Dad grew up going on vacation when he was a kid. It's filled with memories. But remember a couple years ago when there's this massive forest fire there, and it nearly knocked out the entire town? Maybe you're familiar. Thousands of acres, hundreds of homes and businesses that were left just destroyed. And it's all started with a couple of guys walking up a trail, going off the edge, and just flicking matches off the edge of the trail. And I was thinking about that and going back every year or two and seeing it. You're literally seeing the forest regrow and new growth come in, and you're seeing charred trees kind of become green again. You're seeing homes and businesses rebuilt everywhere. And I had this thought as we were driving home yesterday, that from a single match, it nearly engulfed, the fire that ensued nearly engulfed the entire community and burnt everything down in its track, killing people, destroying homes, livelihoods, businesses. It disrupted the ecosystem. And that is what the power of sin is like in our life. And I don't mean this I think you know how I would frame this. Like, the world is on fire. Some of our interior worlds are on fire. But I have good news for you this morning. In Gatlinburg, once the fire was extinguished, something crazy has happened. Things have grown back thicker, healthier, richer, more vibrant, and dense than they were even before. There was a purging. There was an angry clean of the entire ecosystem. And out of that, new growth has occurred. And just like the fire started from a single origin point and spread almost exponentially, destroying everything in sight, the compounding effect of sin is enormous. But so too is the repairing love of Jesus. I just want to ask this, and then we're going to take a moment, sing, and you can come forward and take it back to your seat, participate, and we'll pray to wrap things up. But can you imagine a world that is full of the compounding effects of love? Can you imagine what your life as a single starting point in your heart, in your home, in your relationships, in your conversations, in your workplace, on your teams, in your classrooms? Can you imagine the compounding effect of people marked by love in a world disrupted by chaos? Disrupted from a disconnection from love. Imagine the compounding effects of reframing your relationship out of a posture of sin and into a posture of love and wrestling with it honestly. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine what our church could become? Can you imagine it? And so I'm going to ask you to imagine it, and in two ways. During this time, it's a moment. What practice can we attach to this dynamic? Well, one is confession. We need to reclaim the art of what it means to confess to God our need for God, our need for forgiveness of God, and to reorient our hearts into His love and away from ourselves that turns us inward on ourselves. And the second is to remember the sacrifice of Christ through communion. His broken body shed for us is what heals us and has the power to overcome the power of sin in our life. So in just a moment, I'll invite you forward to take the elements, and you can take it at your will, in your timing, from your seat, up front, whatever makes sense to you. But first, let me utter this prayer. Father, today we confess as a body our need for you. We are desperate. We are growing in our awareness and desperation for transformation, for growth. God, would you light a fire in our hearts that becomes the compounding effect of love in our lives for the sake of other people, for your glory, and for the sake of our flourishing, for the sake of a church that is thriving and a community that's coming alive and being reoriented into your love. God, I pray that you help us to wrestle very seriously with the things that need wrestled with. Help us to wrestle in love very seriously with grace and truth, charitably and confessionally in the light of what your scripture says about what it means to be human and complex issues. But more than that today, I feel pastorally that the moment today is just to awaken our hearts for our needs, for you, for your forgiveness, for your recalibration, for the fact that you love us enough to wake us up to the rotten banana in the bags of our lives, in our heart, in our experience, in our relationship. Would you come in a present way, and that this would be a moment marked by experience of grace and not condemnation, conviction and empowerment, and a love of your presence. Jesus, come and meet with us. As we sing, you may come forward.